Single dad janitor yelled, "Don't eat that dessert," at CEO. Then she parked her Ferrari at his door. What if I told you a single dad janitor, worn down by life but holding on to love for his little girl, ended up saving the life of a powerful CEO with nothing but his instincts? What if I told you that instead of "thank you," her first words planted the seed of a story that would change all three of their lives forever? This isn't just about a janitor or a CEO. It's about walls breaking, hearts opening, and the kind of love money can't buy. But when rumors, scandals, and impossible choices threatened to tear them apart, one condition and one public confession turned everything upside down. Stay with me till the end, because what began with a poisoned dessert became a tale of courage, sacrifice, and a love that dared to park itself right at the doorstep of a man who thought happiness wasn't meant for him. Now let's dive in. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed faintly through the marble hallways as John Hayes guided his mop across the floor, his movements steady, almost rhythmic. Each stroke of the mop left a faint sheen behind, though no one paused long enough to notice. In this towering executive building, men in tailored suits and women in sharp heels ruled the hours, while John moved quietly in the background. At 36, he carried more weight on his shoulders than most of the people who walked past him without a glance. His heart was tethered not to these walls of wealth and power, but to a little girl waiting in a modest apartment across town. Lily, with her boundless energy and soft laughter, was the reason he endured every long shift. While others chased promotions and bonuses, John chased stability, enough to keep food on the table and light in his daughter's eyes. The world might have reduced him to unnoticed footsteps in polished hallways, but he walked with quiet pride. That evening, the air in the grand dining hall felt heavier than usual. Golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over crystal glasses and polished silverware. Executives gathered in hushed clusters, their conversations weaving between numbers, strategies, and conquests. John moved along the edges of the room, mop set aside, now carrying a tray of empty glasses he had been asked to clear. To most, he was invisible, a shadow in a crisp uniform. But his eyes caught something others overlooked. On a long table near the front, a dessert tray glistened under the chandelier light. At first glance, it appeared harmless, a selection of mousses, delicate cakes, and sugared fruits. Yet as he stepped closer, his breath caught. There, in the chocolate mousse, tiny fragments reflected the light unnaturally. They weren't sugar crystals, they were sharp, glass. John's heart pounded in his chest. A second later, his gaze darted across the room and landed on Vivian Cross. The CEO of the company, known for her poise and untouchable authority, had just lifted her spoon, her elegant hands steady as though she ruled even her own hunger. Conversations swirled around her, board members hanging on her every word, her presence commanding without effort. John felt a surge of panic. He looked again at the mousse. There was no mistake. Those were shards that could cut, harm, or worse. He opened his mouth, but hesitation clawed at him. He was a janitor, a man whose words rarely mattered in rooms like this. If he was wrong, he would be humiliated, maybe even fired. But if he stayed silent, the spoon moved closer to her lips, and instinct overtook fear. His voice erupted across the hall, louder than he ever thought himself capable of. "Don't eat that dessert!" The room froze. Knives paused halfway through steaks, glasses halted in midair. Laughter evaporated into silence, dozens of eyes turned in unison toward the source of the interruption, the janitor at the edge of the room. John felt the heat of their stares, but his focus stayed locked on Vivian. Vivian's hand stilled, the spoon hovering just inches from her lips. Her striking eyes narrowed, and in that frozen second, silence became a living thing. No one interrupted her, not in meetings, not in boardrooms, and certainly not in front of her executives. A ripple of disbelief moved through the room, and John could hear the whispers already starting. Did the janitor just yell? Her face hardened, the smooth mask of authority slipping into something sharp, wounded by public humiliation. Her gaze met John's, a mix of irritation and shock. The weight of that look nearly made him falter. Yet he lifted his arm, pointing toward the dessert tray, his voice steady now. "Look at it. The mousse. It isn't safe." For a moment, Vivian didn't move. She glanced down at the dish, then back at him, as though daring him to explain. The board members shifted in their seats, some exchanging skeptical looks, others craning their necks toward the table. John swallowed hard and gestured again. "There are shards in it. Tiny pieces of glass." His words rang out, filling the silence. A murmur swept the room, a wave of unease breaking against the stillness. One of the executives leaned forward, squinting at the dessert. Vivian's perfectly composed hand trembled ever so slightly as she lowered her spoon. Slowly, cautiously, she tilted the plate toward the light, and there it was, clear as day. Tiny, jagged slivers glimmered like cruel stars against the smooth mousse. Gasps erupted around the room. Someone cursed under their breath. A chair scraped loudly against the marble floor as another executive pushed back in alarm. Vivian's breath hitched, and though she quickly masked it, her hand gave her away, gripping the spoon tighter than before. John exhaled, though his body remained tense. He hadn't imagined it. He had saved her, maybe even saved her life. But instead of relief, a strange tension gripped the air. Vivian lowered her spoon completely now, setting it on the table as though it had betrayed her. Her eyes flicked toward John again, unreadable this time, a storm gathering behind her calm surface. For the first time, the unshakable CEO had been stopped, not by a rival, not by a board vote, but by a janitor. Around them, the whispers grew louder, employees torn between awe and disbelief. John stood frozen in place, pulse racing, unsure if he had crossed a line he could never step back from. Vivian's lips parted slightly as though she might speak, but no words came. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her spoon untouched, her expression caught somewhere between anger, humiliation, and an emotion she could not yet name. Gratitude? Vulnerability? Fear? And as the silence deepened, John realized the hall was still watching, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see whether the janitor would be punished for his audacity, or whether the powerful CEO would acknowledge a truth she almost swallowed whole. Vivian's hand tightened around the edge of her chair, her eyes still locked on John. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that breathless pause, it was impossible to tell. Would she lash out in fury, or would she thank the man who had just changed everything? The air in the grand dining hall was still thick with tension as John walked out of the building, the echo of whispers following him long after he set down his mop. He didn't look back at the chandeliers or the polished glass doors. His mind was already elsewhere, on Lily waiting at home, on the quiet safety of their small apartment, far away from the accusing eyes of the powerful. By the time he reached their neighborhood, the world felt like it had shifted. He unlocked the peeling wooden door, greeted by the faint smell of spaghetti from last night and the warm hum of the heater that groaned against the keys. Winter chill. Lily ran to him as she always did, her little arms wrapping tight around his waist, and for a moment the weight of the evening eased from his chest. He tucked her into bed, brushing her soft hair back, her innocent smile shining through the dim light of their second-hand lamp. She whispered about school, about how tomorrow she wanted apple slices in her lunch, not crackers. And John nodded with a tired grin. The world outside could roar with wealth and scandal, but here, in this tiny room, everything was simple, fragile and precious. When Lily's eyes finally closed, John lingered by her side, listening to the sound of her steady breathing. He rose quietly and padded into the kitchen, pulling out an old lunchbox to pack for tomorrow. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. Sandwich, fruit, a tiny note scribbled on a scrap of paper with a silly doodle to make her smile. Then, suddenly, headlights swept across the cracked walls of their apartment, too bright, too polished, not the kind of car that belonged in this street of rusted vehicles and broken sidewalks. John frowned, his body tightening with unease as the low purr of an expensive engine filled the night air. He pulled back the curtain just enough to see. Parked against the curb was a sleek, blood-red Ferarri, its paint gleaming like fire under the street lamp. The engine purred softly before cutting off, and then the door opened with a click that didn't belong in his world. Out stepped Vivian Cross. Her heels clicked sharply against the cracked pavement, each step deliberate, a sound that carried power even in a street where power was rarely seen. John froze at the window, heart pounding. What was she doing here? The CEO, who only hours ago had stared him down in front of her empire, was now standing outside his crumbling apartment. He stepped to the door before she could knock, pulling it open with a mix of confusion and wariness. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Him in his worn shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her in a tailored coat, that whispered wealth with Eve, every stitch. Vivian's eyes softened, but her tone carried the same edge it always did. "You saved me today," she said firmly, "and I don't overlook debts." Before John could respond, a small voice drifted from behind him. "Daddy, who's the fancy lady?" Lily had woken, rubbing her eyes, her little figure peeking from the hallway. Vivian's gaze shifted, and for the briefest second, her icy composure cracked. Her eyes rested on Lily, wide and curious, and something unspoken flickered there. An ache, a longing she never allowed herself to show. John's back stiffened. His pride rose like armor. He stepped slightly in front of his daughter, shielding her from the weight of the moment. His voice was calm but firm. "It's late. You shouldn't be here." Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile, though it wasn't one of mockery. It was a smile that seemed to hold more questions than answers, as though she was studying him in a way she hadn't allowed before. "This isn't over, Mr. Hayes," she murmured, her words deliberate, heavy with promise. She turned, her heels striking the pavement again, the sharp rhythm fading as she slipped back into her Ferrari. The engine roared to life, the glow of red taillights washing over the street like a warning flare. John stood frozen at the doorway, Lily clutching his hand now, her sleepy voice whispering again, "Daddy, is she coming back?" He didn't answer. He just watched the Ferrari vanish into the night, a knot tightening in his chest. He didn't know whether Vivian's visit was the beginning of a blessing or the start of a storm he wasn't ready to weather. And as the sound of her engine faded into silence, John realized the quiet life he had fought so hard to protect might have just been shattered in a single night. John closed the door slowly, pressing his palm against the wood as if it could hold back the world outside. But deep down, he knew Vivian Cross would return, and when she did, his life would never be the same again. The night after Vivian's Ferrari disappeared down the street, John lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Lily slept soundly beside her stuffed rabbit, but sleep refused to come to him. Vivian's words replayed in his head. "This isn't over, Mr. Hayes." He pressed his palm against the mattress, grounding himself. He had built his life around quiet predictability, around keeping Lily safe from chaos. Yet for the first time in years, uncertainty had stepped through his door. The days that followed seemed ordinary at first. The same bus rides to work, the same mop swishing across marble floors, the same polite nods from people who barely knew his name. But soon, John began to notice something different. Vivian Cross, the CEO who had always seemed far above the world he lived in, began appearing more often in his orbit. She never made her presence obvious. She came under the guise of inspecting the kitchens or walking through the lobby to check the flow of things. But John saw through it. Her eyes lingered longer than they should. Her steps slowed when she passed him. He could feel the weight of her gaze, sharp yet curious, as though she was trying to understand him in a way she never understood anyone else. At first, he tried to ignore it. He kept his head down, focusing on his work. But each time she appeared, the air seemed to shift. Other employees whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward John, the janitor and the CEO. It was the kind of pairing that fueled office gossip. One evening, after his shift, John lifted Lily onto his hip at the bus stop. Her small backpack bounced against his shoulder as she chattered about her day. The bus rumbled away behind them, and the two began their walk home along cracked sidewalks. He didn't realize someone was following until he heard the faint, deliberate click of heels. Vivian kept her distance at first, her tailored coat catching the glow of passing headlights. Curiosity had drawn her here, though she would never admit it as loud. She watched as John carried Lily with practiced ease, adjusting her weight without breaking stride. She saw how he tilted his head to listen attentively to his daughter's excited rambling, how his weary face softened every time Lily smiled. When they reached the apartment, Vivian's steps faltered. She stood at the edge of the street, gazing at the building that John and Lily called home. The walls were cracked, paint peeling in places, and the narrow windows reflected more shadows than light. Yet inside, she could see small signs of care. Flower pots clinging to the sill, a curtain neatly pinned back, the faint hum of warmth that came not from money, but from effort. Something in her chest twisted unexpectedly. She, who had lived in sprawling mansions with glass walls and sweeping staircases, suddenly felt a pang of unfamiliar envy. John's home was modest, fragile even, but it was built with sacrifice, with love. John, sensing her gaze, turned his head sharply. His jaw tightened the instant he spotted her standing there, eyes lingering where they didn't belong. "People like you don't belong here," he muttered, his voice carrying across the distance. For a heartbeat, Vivian looked as though she might retreat, but then her chin lifted proudly. She stepped closer, her heels crunching against gravel. "Maybe," she replied, her voice low but steady. "That's exactly why I should be here." John's expression hardened, a wall rising behind his eyes. He didn't want her pity. He didn't want her intrusion. Yet something in her words unsettled him, a crack forming in the certainty he always clung to. He turned away before she could say more, guiding Lily inside, shutting the thin door between their two worlds. That night, the tension still clung to him like a shadow. Lily sat at their tiny table, her pencil twirling absent-mindedly in her small hands as John reheated leftoff. As the sound of the microwave filled the silence until her soft voice broke it, "Daddy," she asked quietly, "is the fancy car lady lonely?" John froze, the spoon in his hand pausing halfway to his lips. He looked at Lily, startled by the innocence in her eyes and the wisdom hidden behind it. He wanted to dismiss the question, to wave it away as childish curiosity, but her gaze held him. It was as if she had seen something he refused to admit, something about Vivian's carefully built armor that was not as strong as it seemed. His chest tightened. He shook his head, trying to mask his unease with a small smile. "Eat your dinner, sweetheart," he said softly, though his voice carried more weight than he intended. But as he watched Lily bend over her plate, her tiny brow furrowed in thought, John felt a fear stir inside him, not of Vivian's presence, not of gossip or scandal, but of the possibility that Lily might be right. What if the woman who stepped out of a Ferarri onto cracked pavement was lonelier than anyone realized? The thought unsettled him more than all the whispers at work, because if it were true, then Vivian Cross wasn't just dangerous to his peace. She was dangerous to his heart. John leaned back in his chair, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp seeping through their window. Outside, a distant engine roared to life, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Vivian's footsteps would soon echo again in his world. This time, closer than ever before. The next morning, the whispers began. They drifted through polished corridors like smoke, half-truths, smirks, questions murmured behind manicured hands. The CEO and the janitor. The phrase carried a sting sharp enough to wound. John heard it as he pushed his mop across the floor, eyes fixed downward, pretending the words didn't touch him. He could bear the ridicule himself, he had endured worse, but the thought of Lily hearing those whispers one day tightened his chest. She deserved a father untainted by scandal, not a man reduced to gossip's amusement. Vivian, however, seemed untouched. She walked at those same halls with unflinching grace, her heels striking marble like a metronome of authority. If the rumors bothered her, she didn't show it. Instead, her eyes found John more often, her voice softer when it addressed him. She was a fortress in the eyes of her board, yet a door seemed to crack open whenever she crossed paths with him. Days later, an invitation arrived, not written but spoken. "Dinner," she said, as John emptied a wastebasket outside her office. Her tone carried the weight of command, but her eyes betrayed something gentler, almost pleading. "Bring Lily. My home. Tomorrow evening." John wanted to refuse. His pride screamed against it. But when Lily overheard, her eyes lit up with such innocent excitement that his resolve faltered. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "A real castle dinner." And in that moment, he couldn't say no. The next evening, the three of them stood before Vivian's mansion. Its gates rose like iron arms, its windows glowing golden in the twilight. For Lily, it was a dream. Her small hand gripped John's tightly as her gaze darted to the chandeliers glittering through tall panes of glass. "It's like a fairy tale," she breathed. John swallowed hard, wishing her world could be simpler, safer. Inside, grandeur enveloped them. The ceilings stretched impossibly high, paintings lined the walls, and polished marble reflected the chandelier's glow. Lily's laughter echoed as she twirled in the vast entryway, her worn shoes squeaking against floors that had never known such weight. Vivian watched, something unrecognizable flickering across her poised features. For the first time, her house felt alive. Dinner began with stiffness. John sat like a soldier in enemy territory, shoulders rigid, every muscle alert. Vivian tried to fill the silence, asking Lily about school, about her favorite books. To her surprise, the child responded eagerly, her natural warmth melting the edges of Vivian's carefully crafted composure. Slowly, a new rhythm formed around the table. Awkward, yet strangely warm. John noticed it too, though he resisted letting it reach him. He kept his fork moving, his words clipped, as though kindness itself might betray his boundaries. Yet his eyes betrayed him whenever Lily giggled, or whenever Vivian's laughter slipped free, unpolished and genuine. Halfway through the meal, Vivian set her glass down. Her fingers lingered at the stem, hesitant in a way no boardroom had ever seen. Then, gathering her breath, she laid something on the table far heavier than fine silverware. "John," she began, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it, "I've built empires, negotiated with men who thought themselves invincible. I've commanded rooms where silence was obedience, but I've never built a family." Her eyes flicked to Lily, then back to John. "I want to help you. And maybe," her words faltered, fragile, "maybe be a part of this." The room fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to hum. Lily looked from one adult to the other, her curious eyes wide. John froze, fork suspended above his plate, as though the very air had turned heavy. Slowly, deliberately, he set the utensil down. The weight of her confession pressed on him, stirring both temptation and fear. He had guarded his life carefully, every choice measured for Lily's sake. To let Vivian step closer was to invite risk, but something in her voice had cracked the wall he had built. "If you mean this," he said finally, his tone firm, "then you'll have to accept one condition." Vivian's pulse quickened. She leaned forward, her flawless composure trembling at the edges. "And what's that?" John's eyes locked with hers, unyielding. "You don't buy your place in Lily's life. You earn it." The words struck deeper than Vivian expected. She was a woman used to purchasing power, to negotiating terms with ink and signatures. But here was a man who offered her no contract, only truth. For the first time in years, her chest tightened. Not with strategy, but with fear. Because this wasn't about wealth or status. It was about risking her heart. And as she sat in the glow of her grand chandelier, across from a janitor who spoke with more authority than any shareholder she had ever faced, Vivian realized something terrifying. She could build skyscrapers that touched the clouds, but she had no blueprint for this. Across the table, Lily giggled softly, unaware of the storm brewing in the silence. But John's words still hung heavy in the air, and Vivian's hands trembled against the linen. For the first time, the woman who never lost control was about to discover what it truly meant to fight for a place in someone's life. The silence of that dinner table lingered long after the plates had been cleared. Vivian's hands still trembled at the memory of John's words. Earn, not buy. It was a condition that stripped her of her usual weapons, wealth, status, control. Yet for reasons she couldn't explain, she accepted it, maybe even welcomed it. For the first time in her life, she wanted to prove herself not to a boardroom, but to a little girl and her weary father. Weeks passed, and slowly, the red Ferrari became a familiar sight, parked outside John's crumbling apartment building. At first, neighbors gawked, whispering as they peeked through blinds. But soon, it became less spectacle and more routine. Vivian Cross, the untouchable CEO, was no longer just a headline. She was the woman fumbling with pancake batter in John's tiny kitchen, the one who sat cross-legged on a worn carpet reading bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that made Lily laugh until her cheeks hurt. John watched it all warily at first. He waited for the moment Vivian would retreat, bored of cracked walls and second-hand furniture, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned in, helping Lily with school projects, listening with genuine interest as the child explained her drawings, laughing even when her first batch of pancakes ended up blackened in the pan. In those small, imperfect moments, Vivian revealed something startling. Beneath the steel of her public persona, there was a woman who longed for warmth just as much as they did. For John, happiness had always been something fragile, like a soap bubble, beautiful, but destined to burst. Yet, as days turned into weeks, he began to wonder if this bubble might hold. If maybe, just maybe, Vivian's presence wasn't a fleeting spark, but a flame meant to stay. But as joy began to settle into their lives, trouble came crashing in with the force of a storm. One morning, John walked past a corner newsstand, his stomach sinking at the bold black letters splashed across glossy covers. Janitor manipulates CEO, love or ladder climb. The story spread like wildfire, fueled by a rival of Vivian's eager to watch her empire burn. Poisonous rumors claimed John had staged the dessert incident, painting him as a cunning opportunist clawing his way into her wealth. The press devoured the scandal, their cameras lurking outside his building, microphones shoved toward his face as Lily clung to his leg in confusion. "Daddy, why are they saying bad things?" she asked, her small voice trembling. John's heart ached as he pulled her close, shielding her from the cruel lenses. He could endure humiliation, but not at her expense. That night, anger burned in him. He paced their living room, fists clenched. "This is exactly why I didn't want her in our lives," he muttered. Vivian tried to reassure him, her voice soft yet unwavering, but John's pride roared louder. "Lily doesn't deserve this chaos. Maybe it's better if we step away before it destroys everything." His words stabbed the air, but beneath them was fear. The fear of losing not just his peace, but the fragile happiness he had begun to hope for. Vivian's response came not in argument, but in action. Days later, the world gathered at a press conference called by none other than Vivian Carsos herself. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled, the room buzzing with anticipation of blood, of a CEO distancing herself from scandal. John sat in the crowd, Lily's hand clutching his chest tight with dread. Then Vivian stepped onto the stage. Her heels clicked against the floor, her shoulders straight, but her eyes held a fire that silenced the room. She didn't begin with numbers or strategies. She didn't defend herself with contracts or evidence. Instead, her voice rang clear and steady, carrying words that pierced through the noise. "I wasn't only saved from poisoned dessert that day," she said, her gaze sweeping across the flashing cameras. "I was saved from a life without love." Gasps rippled through the crowd, pens freezing mid-scribble. She lifted her chin, unflinching. "John Hayes is not a scandal. He is my future." The words struck like thunder. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, and then the room erupted. Shouts, questions, flashes exploding like fireworks. But John heard none of it. He felt only the weight of Lily's small hand squeezing his, steady and sure, anchoring him as his world tilted in ways he never thought possible. Tears stung his eyes, unbidden, as he looked toward the stage. Vivian stood there, not as the untouchable CEO, but as a woman who had chosen him, who had risked everything for a truth she refused to hide. And in that moment, John realized the storm he had feared wasn't meant to destroy them. It was meant to clear the skies. Later, when the cameras were gone and the world retreated, Vivian found him outside, beneath the glow of streetlights. For a long moment they said nothing. Then John spoke, his voice low, rough with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." Vivian smiled faintly, her eyes soft. "I know, but I wanted to, because some things aren't about saving face. Some things are about saving what matters." Lily slipped her small and into both of theirs, her eyes wide but shining. "Does this mean we're a family now?" John and Vivian exchanged a glance, his guarded, hers hopeful. And then, with a breath that felt like the beginning of something entirely new, John nodded. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "I think it does." And as the night wrapped around them, the truth settled in his chest with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Sometimes love doesn't knock politely, waiting to be invited in. Sometimes it parks itself right at your door, loud, impossible to ignore, daring you to open it. This time, John did. And for once he was glad he did. A janitor, a CEO, and a child once caught between their worlds, now walking forward together toward a future no rumor could erase.